Section 1 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2 by William Henry Wilkins. Book 3, The New Reign. 1737. The news of George I's death reached England 4 days after he had breathed his last at Onusbrook. A messenger bearing sealed dispatches from Lord Townshend arrived at Sir Robert Walpole's house in Arlington Street at noon on Wednesday, June 14th. He was told that the Prime Minister was at Chelsea, and he at once repaired thither. He found the great man at dinner. Walpole was thunderstruck at the news, for the old king was of so strong a constitution that, despite his occasional fainting fits, everyone expected him to live to a green old age, as his mother had done before him. His sudden death, too, might mean the end of the Prime Minister's political career. But there was no time for vain regrets. The king was dead, long live the king. So ordering his horse to be saddled, Walpole rode off at full speed to Richmond, where George Augustus then was, to announce the tidings and pay homage to his new sovereign. The day was hot, and so furiously did he ride that he killed, his son tells us, 2 horses between Chelsea and Richmond. But then his son was given to exaggeration. Walpole arrived at Richmond Lodge about 3 o'clock and requested to be shown at once into the royal presence. The Duchess of Dorset, who was in waiting, said it was impossible, as the prince had undressed and gone to bed after dinner, according to his custom, and the princess was resting also, and no one dared disturb them. But Walpole explained that his business brooked of no delay, and the Duchess went to wake them. The king, as he must now be called, very irate at being disturbed, came into the antechamber in haste with his breeches in his hand. He was one of those princes who are fated to appear ridiculous even at the greatest moments of their lives. Walpole fell on one knee, kissed the hand holding the breeches, and told his Majesty that his royal sire was dead, and he was King of England. "Dat is one big lie," shouted King George II, as he had shouted at the Duke of Roxburgh on a memorable occasion some time before. But Walpole, unlike the Duke, showed no resentment at being given the lie, and for all answer produced Townshend's dispatch, which gave particulars of the late king's death. George snatched the letter from him and eagerly conned it, but his face did not relax as he read, nor did his manner unbend towards the Prime Minister. Walpole uttered some words of formal condolence, but they were ungraciously ignored. After an awkward pause, he asked the king his pleasure with regard to the Accession Council, the proclamation, and other matters necessary to be done at once, naturally expecting that he should be commanded to attend to them. "Go to Chiswick and take your directions from Sir Spencer Compton," said the king curtly, and turned his back as an intimation, and the interview was at an end. George II then went to tell the great news to his queen, and the crestfallen minister withdrew to go as ordered to Compton. Walpole's reflections on his ride to Chiswick must have been bitter indeed. Well might he exclaim, as his fallen rival Bolingbroke had done under a similar reverse. What a world is this, and how does fortune banter us? For years he had been Prime Minister with almost absolute power, enjoying to the full the confidence of his sovereign. Suddenly he was stripped of every shred of authority and dismissed, for the king's bidding him to go to Compton was tantamount to a dismissal, without the slightest consideration, like a dishonest servant. Walpole knew that George II owed him a grudge for not having kept his promises at their reconciliation, and disliked him, as he disliked all who enjoyed the late king's favour. But the Prime Minister hoped that time and Caroline's influence would put things right. He did not know that Pulteney had repeated certain remarks he had incautiously made soon after the reconciliation, when Pulteney asked him what terms he had got for the Prince of Wales. Walpole answered with a sneer, "Why, he is to go to court again, and he will have his drums and guards and such fine things." "But," said Pulteney, "is the prince to be left regent, as he was when the king first left England?" Walpole replied, "Certainly not. He does not deserve it. We have done more than enough for him, and if it were to be done again, we would not do so much." George II's little mind resented slights of this kind more than greater wrongs, and now he took his revenge. Sir Spencer Compton, to whom the disconcerted minister sadly made his way, had been Speaker of the House of Commons, Treasurer of the Prince of Wales' household, and Paymaster of the army. Compton was much more of a courtier than a politician. He was a man of the mediocre order of ability that often makes a good and safe official. He knew all about forms, procedure, and precedents, But he was not a leader of men, and he was quite unprepared for, and quite unequal to, the great position now thrust upon him. Walpole, who knew the man with whom he had to deal, felt towards Compton no personal resentment. He acquainted him briefly with George I.'s death, gave him the new king's commands, and added on his own behalf, "Everything is in your hands. I neither could shake your power if I would, nor would if I could. My time has been, yours is beginning, but as we all must depend in some degree upon our successors, and as it is always prudent for these successors, by way of example, to have some regard for their predecessors, that the measure they mete out may be measured to them again. For this reason I put myself under your protection, and for this reason I expect you will give it. I desire no share of power or business. One of your white sticks, or any employment of that sort, is all I ask, as a mark from the crown that I am not abandoned to the enmity of those whose envy is the only source of their hate." Though Compton was astonished at the news, he did not conceal his delight at the unexpected honor that had fallen upon him. Walpole's speech flattered his vanity, and perhaps also touched his heart. He grandiloquently promised him his protection, and thinking he had nothing to fear from the fallen statesman, took him into his confidence and consulted him as to how he should proceed. The two ministers then drove together to Devonshire House to see the Duke of Devonshire, President of the Council, and arrange for an immediate meeting of the Privy Council. At forms Compton was an adept, but when it came to the speech that had to be put into the king's mouth, he was nonplussed. He took Walpole aside and asked him, as he had composed all the speeches of the late king, to compose this one also. Walpole pretended to demur, but as Compton persisted, he consented and withdrew to a private room in Devonshire House to draft the speech, while Compton set off to do homage to the king and queen. Walpole must have chuckled over his task, for if the president-loving Compton had only consulted the back folios of the Gazette, he would have found plenty of models for the king's speech. But he was so fussed with forms and ceremonies, and so elated with the sense of his new importance, that he was incapable of thinking coherently. The king and queen had driven up from Richmond in the afternoon, and were now arrived at Leicester House. The great news had spread abroad, and all London was flocking to Leicester Fields. When Compton arrived there, the square was so thronged with people who had assembled to cheer their majesties, that the coaches and chairs of the mighty, who were hurrying to pay their court, could scarcely make way through the crowd. Inside Leicester House, the walls were already hung with purple and black, and the queen appeared in black bombazine. But these were the only signs of mourning. All else wore an aspect of rejoicing and congratulation. The new king and queen held a court. The rooms were thronged with the great nobility and high officials, and persons of divers parties and creeds struggled up and down the stairs, all anxious to kiss their majesties' hands and to profess their loyalty and devotion. The queen, who had a keen sense of irony, must have smiled to herself when she contrasted the crowded rooms before her with the thinly attended receptions which Leicester House, except on great occasions such as birthdays, had witnessed during the past few years. This was the proudest hour of Caroline's life. She had reached the summit of her ambition. She had become queen. But the mere show of sovereignty did not content her. She was determined to be the power behind the throne, greater than the throne. It was not enough for her that she had become queen through her husband. She was determined to rule through him also. Did this inscrutable woman, we wonder, in her hour of glory, recall the parallel Leibnitz had drawn long before, when the prospects of the House of Hanover were darkest, between her and England's greatest queen, Elizabeth? Maybe, for, like Elizabeth, Caroline determined to have her Cecil. She knew there was but one man in England capable of maintaining the Hanoverian dynasty upon the throne in peace, and that one was Walpole. She had been dismayed when the king told her that he had sent for Compton, for she knew Compton's weakness. But, like a wise woman, she did not attempt to thwart her husband in the first heat of his resentment against his father's favorite minister, who had been, willingly or unwillingly, the late king's mouthpiece for many slights to him, and perhaps, too, she thought it would be good for Walpole to be taught a lesson. She bided her time. Compton at once had audience of the king. When he came out from the royal closet, he walked across the courtyard to his coach between the lines of bowing and fawning courtiers, all anxious to bask in the rays of the rising sun. They knew full well what this audience portended. Compton, greatly flattered by this homage, drove back to Devonshire House, where he found that the man whom he had superseded had finished the king's speech. Compton was graciously pleased to approve the draft. He took it and copied it in his own handwriting. He then again repaired to Leicester House to present it to the king. On this occasion he was accompanied by the Duke of Devonshire and other privy councillors, including Walpole, who were to be present at the Accession Council. George II liked the speech well enough, but found fault with one paragraph and desired that it should be altered. Compton wished it to stand, for he knew not how to change it, but the king was obdurate and very testy at being opposed. Compton was then so incredibly foolish, from the point of view of his own interest, as to ask Walpole to go to the king's closet and see what he could do. Walpole went, nothing loath, and improved the occasion by declaring to the king his willingness to serve him either in or out of office. This was the queen's opportunity. According to some, it was she who suggested that Walpole should be sent for. She certainly suggested to the king that perhaps he had been a little hasty, and it would be bad for his affairs to employ a man like Compton, who had already shown himself inferior in ability to the minister whom he was to succeed. But Caroline could do more at this juncture than suggest, and leave the leaven to work in the king's mind. George II held his accession council that same night at Leicester House. He read his speech to his faithful councillors, in which he lamented the sudden and unexpected death of the king, my dearest father. He spoke of his love and affection for England, and declared his intention of preserving the laws and liberties of the kingdom, and upholding the Constitution as it stood. If he felt any relenting towards Walpole, it was not visible in his manner. Compton took the first place, and the man who had hitherto dominated the councils of the king, and was still nominally prime minister, was completely ignored by the new sovereign. The office-seekers were not slow to follow the lead. For the next few days Leicester House was crowded every day, but whenever Walpole appeared the courtiers shrank away from him as though he had the plague. Walpole himself, though he knew the utter weakness of Compton, had no hope of being continued in office, and hourly expected to receive the king's command to give up the seals. "I shall certainly go out," he said to his friend Sir William Young, after the council, "but let me advise you not to go into violent opposition, as we must soon come in again." Yonge quickly had experience of going out, for he was dismissed the next day. The king had always hated him and called him Stinking Yonge. Lord Malpas, Walpole's son-in-law, was dismissed also. But the public announcement of the prime minister's dismissal tarried unaccountably. Unaccountably, that is, to those who were not behind the scenes. The queen's influence was now beginning to tell. At first she persuaded the king to delay, for she knew that if he delayed he would reflect, and if he reflected he would change his mind. She reminded him of the trouble a change of ministers would involve before he was comfortably seated on the throne, and she knew the king hated trouble. The king objected to Walpole's notorious greed for gold, but the queen met this by saying that, with so many opportunities of amassing wealth, he must by this time have become so rich that he would want no more, and this, in a lesser degree, applied to his colleagues. "The old leeches," she cynically added, "will not be so hungry as the new ones, and will know their business much better." The critical situation of foreign affairs was another of the arguments used by the queen in favor of Walpole, for no one had the same grasp of the tangled skeins of foreign policy as he. The European courts, which did not understand the working of the English Constitution, might become alarmed at a sudden change of ministry, and imagine that it foretold a change in England's foreign policy, thus creating a general distrust, which would be dangerous to the reigning dynasty, more especially as there was always the fear of secret negotiations going on between James and the Roman Catholic courts of Europe. This was particularly true of France, with whom it was of the utmost importance to maintain good relations at the present juncture. Whilst Caroline was thus arguing, as luck would have it, Horace Walpole, the Prime Minister's brother, who was ambassador to France, arrived in England with a letter which his diplomacy had obtained from Cardinal de Fleury, pledging his master to maintain the treaties of France had entered into with the late king, and to show goodwill towards George and the ill will to James. All these considerations told, but the most cogent argument which the queen urged, and the one which had undoubtedly the most weight with the king, was the settlement of the civil list. The new civil list, Caroline reminded the king, was pressing, but a change of ministers was not. There was nobody so able as Walpole to secure for them a handsome increase of the civil list, for, as the old king said, he could turn stones into gold. Why then let private resentment lead to personal inconvenience? Nothing was done during the king's stay at Leicester House, and in the eyes of the world Compton was still first in the king's favour. At the end of the week the court moved to Kensington, and by the time the queen had worked so well that the king sent for Walpole, and asked him about the civil list. The new monarch mentioned a sum so large that Walpole was staggered, accustomed though he was to Hanoverian rapacity, but he showed nothing of his feeling in his face, and promised to do his utmost to serve his Majesty. He then had an audience of the Queen, who confided to him that Compton's estimate had by no means satisfied the King's demands, and he had proposed that she should have only a poor £60,000 a year. Walpole at once grasped the situation. He declared that he would obtain a jointure for Her Majesty of £100,000 a year, which was £40,000 more than Compton had proposed, and he would force Parliament to meet the King's wishes. It was said that Walpole bought his influence with the Queen for this extra £40,000 a year, but that was not wholly true. Quite apart from money, Caroline had wit enough to see that the interests of the House of Hanover could be best served by Walpole, and of all English statesmen he was the one who could most be trusted to frustrate the Jacobites, for the rival claims of the Stuarts were an ever-present danger to the Hanoverian family until 1745. She was, of course, not averse to receiving something in return for her support, and Walpole, it must be admitted, paid, or rather made the nation pay, for it handsomely. In addition to the Queen's £100,000 a year, Somerset House and Richmond Lodge were made over to her. Her income was double what any Queen-Consort had enjoyed before, and more than any has been granted since. Walpole now realized that all that lay between him and power was a question of money. He therefore went next morning to the King with carefully prepared estimates. He proposed that His Majesty's civil list should consist primarily of the £700,000 a year paid to the late King, £100,000 more, which had been paid directly to the Prince of Wales in the last reign, but which would now be vested in the King to make what allowance he pleased to his eldest son, and a further increase of £130,000 a year arising out of certain funds. In all, therefore, the King would receive the enormous sum of more than £900,000 a year. This George agreed to, for though he would have liked more, he had the sense to see that it was impossible to get it. The Queen had impressed upon him that Walpole was the only man who could carry such a large increase through the House of Commons. Pulteney and other opposition politicians were ready to promise more to gain office, but their promises were nothing worth, for they had neither the ability nor the power to carry a large grant through Parliament. The King therefore took Walpole by the hand, and said that he had considered the matter and intended to continue him in office on the understanding that he would carry through the civil list at the sum named. He added significantly, "Consider, Sir Robert, what makes me easy in this matter will prove for your ease too. It is for my life, it is to be fixed, and it is for your life." Matters thus being settled, the Queen that night at the drawing-room made known her approval of Walpole in a characteristic manner. Lady Walpole had come to court to pay her respects to the King and Queen, but she could not make her way to the royal dais, for the lords and ladies turned their backs on the wife of the fallen minister, as they considered him, and refused to yield her place. By dint of much struggling she managed to reach the third row, where she was espied by the Queen, who, beckoning to her, called out, "There, I am sure, I see a friend." The crowd in front immediately divided, and Lady Walpole performed her obeisance in the sight of the wondering court. The King and Queen smiled and chatted with her some little time. All the courtiers noted it, and, as I came away, said Lady Walpole afterwards, I might have walked over their heads had I pleased. Thus Compton's brief dream of authority vanished, and Walpole's tenure and power was assured. The crowd of placemen who had surrounded Compton transferred their attentions once more to Walpole, and the former was now as much deserted as the latter had been. The most extraordinary part of the whole affair was that, though Compton's friends, chief among whom were Mrs. Howard, the Duke of Argyll, and Lord Chesterfield, were plunged into despondency by his fall, Compton himself heeded little these vicissitudes, and was content to be given, by way of compensation, a place about the court, the garter, and a peerage under the title of Earl of Wilmington. If the man had not been such a fool, he might almost have passed for a philosopher. When Parliament met a week later, it was seen by all the world that Walpole retained his old place. It was Walpole who proposed and carried through Parliament the bloated civil list. Such was the minister's power that no one in the House of Commons dared raise his voice against it except Shippen, the Jacobite, who was known as downright Shippen for his outspokenness. He had been sent to the Tower in 1717 for proclaiming in the House of Commons the obvious truth that George I was a stranger to our language and constitution. Yet, avowed Jacobite though Shippen remained, Walpole never repeated this error. Walpole had a great respect for him and used to say he was the only man in Parliament whose price he did not know. Shippen on his part declared, "Robin and I are two honest men. He is for King George and I am for King James. But these men in long cravats only desire place under King George or King James." Parliament, having duly passed the civil list, was dissolved by the king in person, who had one great advantage over his father, in that he was able to read his speeches in English, albeit with a broad German accent. Walpole now had it all his own way. All the old king's ministers were kept in office, even the Duke of Newcastle, whom the king had especially hated, all that is, except Lord Berkeley, who was forced to resign in consequence of the Queen having found in the late king's cabinet a paper, of which mention has already been made, containing a plan to kidnap the Prince of Wales and send him off to America. Berkeley, who had drawn up the document, found it convenient to withdraw to the Continent. No other changes of importance were made. Malpas was reinstated. Yonge had to remain out of office for a little time longer, but was eventually given a small post. The Jacobites had always expected that the death of George I would, in some way, benefit the Stuart cause. In what way it was not clear, for George II, when Prince of Wales, was less unpopular than his father. But the Jacobites hugged the hope that the death of the first Hanoverian king would plunge the country into confusion, and so it might have done if George I had not been so inconsiderate as to die at a moment when the Jacobites were in great confusion themselves. For the last 2 or 3 years, James's little court had been distracted by internal jealousies and intrigues. Lord Mar, who superseded Bolingbroke, had, notwithstanding all his services, been superseded by Hay, whom James appointed his Secretary of State and created Earl of Inverness. Hay had a wife who shared in these barren honours, which, it was said, she had done much to win. Her brother Murray, James created Earl of Dunbar. This trio, of whom the lady was the most arrogant, entirely governed James, who, like a true Stuart, was swayed by favourites. They created great dissatisfaction at his court. It was not long before his consort, Clementina, who was a princess of great beauty and virtue, but extremely high-spirited, had cause to complain of the insolence of Inverness and his wife. It was said that Lady Inverness was James's mistress, and colour was lent to the rumour by the fact that Clementina insisted upon her dismissal from her court. James refused, and she withdrew from her husband's palace and retired to the convent of St. Cecilia at Rome. A long correspondence ensued between James and Clementina, but she declined to return unless Lady Inverness was dismissed, and so brought about a virtual separation. This domestic scandal did great harm to the Stuart cause among the Roman Catholic princes of Europe, all of whom warmly espoused Clementina's side. The emperor, who was her kinsman, was highly displeased. The Queen of Spain, who was her friend, was indignant. The Jacobites in England were divided amongst themselves, and in Scotland James's followers fell off everywhere in numbers and in zeal. The strongest representations were made to James from every side, but for a long time he turned a deaf ear to them all. At last, after protracted negotiations, he accepted Inverness's resignation, and Lady Inverness went with her husband. Clementina agreed to leave her convent and rejoin her husband, who was then at Bologna. She was actually on the road when the news arrived of George I's death. Immediately, all domestic considerations were swallowed up in the political necessities of the moment. Seeing the advisability of being nearer England at this crisis, James set out from Bologna on the pretext of meeting his consort, but turning back halfway, he posted with all speed to Lorraine. As soon as he arrived at Nancy in Lorraine, he sent a messenger to Atterbury, who was acting as his agent in Paris, another to Lord Orrery, his agent in London, and a third to Lockhart at Liege, who was acting as his agent for Scotland. James had no lack of courage, and was anxious to set out for the Highlands at once, though he had neither a settled scheme nor promise of foreign aid. But the news he received from the north of the Tweed was discouraging, and the dispatches from England were worse. Lord Strafford wrote to him, saying that the tide in favour of the Prince and Princess of Hanover, as he called them, was too strong at present for the Jacobites to resist, and it would be better to wait until dissatisfaction broke out again, which he anticipated would not be long. "I am convinced," he wrote, "that the same violent and corrupt measures taken by the father will be pursued by the son, who is passionate, proud, and peevish, and though he talks of ruling by himself, he will just be governed as his father was. but his declarations that he will make no distinction of parties and his turning off the Germans make him popular at present. Strafford, like many others, made the mistake of leaving Queen Caroline out of his calculations. It was impossible for James to stay in Lorraine, for the French government, at the instigation of Walpole, ordered the Duke of Lorraine to expel the pretender from his territory. The Duke, who was only a vassal of France, was forced to obey and urged his unwelcome guest to leave Lorraine within 3 days. So James withdrew under protest. "In my present situation," he wrote to Atterbury, "I cannot pretend to do anything essential for my interest, and all that remains is that the world should see that I have done my part." It must be admitted that he was ready to do it bravely. James first sought refuge in the papal state of Avignon, but here again the relentless English government, acting through the French, managed to hunt him out, and the following year the heir of our Stuart kings was forced to return a fugitive to Italy. He was joined by Clementina, and afterwards lived harmoniously with her. Unfortunate in all else, James was at least fortunate in his consort, for all authorities unite in praising her grace and goodness, her talents and charity. The immediate danger of a Jacobite rising was thus warded off, but so long as James and his 2 sons lived the House of Hanover could not enjoy undisputed title to the throne of England. In these early days, as Caroline knew well, it behoved the princes of the new dynasty to walk warily and court the popular goodwill, for there was always an alternative king in James, who by a turn of fortune's wheel might find himself upon the throne of his fathers. Though official word and most of those in high places were all for the Hanoverian succession, and though Walpole had the means to corrupt members of Parliament and buy constituencies as he would, yet the heart of the people remained very tender toward the exiled royal family and felt a profound compassion for their misfortunes. The excitement consequent on the new reign continued for some months, and the king, not having had time to make himself enemies, was, to outward semblance, popular. A good deal was due to interested motives. The court was crowded with personages struggling for place. Lord Orrery wrote to James, inveighing bitterly against the civility, ignorance, and poor spirit of our nobility and gentry, striving who shall sell themselves at the best price to the court, but resolve to sell themselves at any. Yet he is constrained to add, there do not appear to be many discontented people. Pope, too, who was now quite out of favor at court, wrote to a friend that the new reign has put the whole world into a new state, but, he adds enviously, the only use I have, shall, or wish to make of it, is to observe the disparity of men from themselves in a week's time, desultory leaping and catching of new modes, new manners, and that strong spirit of life with which men, broken and disappointed, resume their hopes, their solicitations, their ambitions. The political Jeremiahs of the time bewailed the wholesale trafficking in places, and the universal corruption. The king himself did not set a high example of public or private honesty. He had wrung the highest sum he could from Parliament for his civil list, and at one of his early councils he distinguished himself by an act which can only be described as dishonest. The timid and time-serving Archbishop of Canterbury, old Dr. Wake, produced the late king's will which had been entrusted to him and handed it to George, fully expecting him to open it and read it to the council. The king took it without a word, put it into his pocket, and walked out of the room. The archbishop was so taken aback at this proceeding that neither he nor the other privy councillors present raised a word in protest. George probably burnt the will after reading it. In any case, it was never seen again. But the old king, who probably feared that some such fate would befall his testament, had taken the precaution to make a second copy, which he entrusted to the safekeeping of his cousin, the Duke of Wolfenbüttel. The Duke soon intimated this fact to the new King of England, and at the same time hinted that he had no wish to make matters disagreeable, which he could easily do if he wished, for the King and Queen of Prussia were furious, if his silence were made worth his while. George took the hint and dispatched a messenger to Wolfenbüttel, promising the Duke a subsidy. In return, the messenger brought back the duplicate of the will, and this too was destroyed. The only excuse that can be urged for the king's conduct, which probably defrauded among others his sister, the Queen of Prussia, and his son, Prince Frederick, was that George I had treated the will of his consort, Sophie Dorothea of Celle, in the same way, to the detriment, it was suspected, of both his son and his daughter. George II, also, when Electoral Prince of Hanover, had reason to believe that his father had unjustly deprived him of a substantial inheritance, which had been left him by his maternal grandfather, the Duke of Celle. The burning of wills seems to have been a peculiarity of the Hanoverian family at this time, for a year or two later Frederick, Prince of Wales, accused his father of destroying the will of his uncle, Ernest Augustus, Duke of York and Bishop of Onnesbroek. He died a year after his brother, George I, and both Prince Friedrich and the Queen of Prussia declared that they would have largely benefited by his death had it not been for the chicanery of George II. Queen Caroline always stoutly denied this imputation and maintained that the Duke of York had nothing to leave except £50,000, which he left to his nephew King George, and his jewels, which he bequeathed to his niece the Queen of Prussia, to whom they were immediately sent. But neither the King nor the Queen of Prussia were satisfied with this explanation, and they also had a further dispute with George about the French possessions of his mother, Sophia Dorothea, which she had inherited through her mother, Eleanor de Aurusse, who was descended from an ancient Huguenot family of Poitou. The person who probably lost most by the destruction of George I's will was the Duchess of Kendal, but she did not venture to lift her voice in protest. George II no doubt felt that she had amassed more than she deserved during the late king's lifetime, and if he allowed her to remain in peaceable possession of her plunder, it was as much as she had any right to expect. The Duchess seems to have thought so too, but her daughter, Lady Walsingham, who was also the late king's daughter, was not so complacent. When a few years later Lord Chesterfield married her in the belief that she was a great heiress, in which hope he was disappointed, she confided to him that George I had left her £40,000 in his will, which had never been paid. Lord Chesterfield, who was then out of favour at court, and had no hope of regaining it, instituted or threatened to institute legal proceedings to recover the legacy. The case never came into court, for half the sum, £20,000, was offered and accepted as a compromise. The aged Duchess of Kendal was the only person in the world who really mourned the late king. Within a week of his death, George I was as completely forgotten as though he had never been. The only reminder of his reign was the official mourning. The Duchess of Kendal had accompanied him on his last journey, but, being indisposed by the sea voyage, she had tarried at The Hague a day to recover, and, like Lord Townshend, was following the king on the road to Hanover, when a messenger rode up to her coach with the tidings of his death. The Duchess was overwhelmed with grief. She beat her breast, tore her hair, and rent the air with her cries. But her sorrow did not get the better of her prudence, for not being sure of the reception that awaited her from the new king, she resolved to remove herself from his Hanoverian dominions, and repaired to the neighbouring territory of Wolfenbüttel. Her fears proved to be groundless, for Queen Caroline harboured towards the ex-mistress no feelings of ill will, and it followed that the king did not either. On the contrary, Caroline had liked the Duchess, who, unlike Lady Darlington, was no mischief-maker, and had personally interceded with George I, though unsuccessfully, to restore her children to the princess. Moreover, she was such an old established institution that Caroline had come to look upon her almost in the light of the late king's wife. The Queen wrote the following letter to her within a fortnight of George I's death. Kensington, June 25th, 1727. My first thought, my dear Duchess, has been of you and the misfortune that has befallen us. I know well your devotion and love for the late king, and I fear for your health. Only the resignation which you have always shown to the divine will can sustain you under such a loss. I wish I could convey to you how much I feel for you and how anxious I am about your health, but it is impossible for me to do so adequately. I cannot tell you how greatly this trouble has affected me. I had the honor of knowing the late king. You know that to know him was sufficient to make one love him also. I know that you always tried to render good service to the king, George II. He knows it too, and will remember it himself to you by letter. I hope you realize that I am your friend. It is my pleasure and my duty to remind you of the fact, and to tell you that I and the king will always be glad to do all we can to help you. Write to me, I pray you, and give me an opportunity to show how much I love you. Caroline. It is impossible to accept literally these expressions of affection. Allowing for exaggeration, they do credit to Caroline's heart, but the letter was probably dictated as much by prudence as by sympathy, for the Duchess of Kendal was then at Wolfenbüttel, and the Duke of Wolfenbüttel had the duplicate of the late king's will. Caroline was anxious to avoid a family scandal, for she knew by experience how bad these things were for the dynasty, and in the negotiations which passed between George II and the Duke, It is probable that the Duchess of Kendal played a part, though it is improbable that she received any portion of the subsidy. That matters were amicably arranged is shown by the fact that a few months later the Duchess returned to England and took up her abode at Kendal House, Twickenham, where she lived in comfortable retirement until the end of her days. She no longer appeared at court, but the king and queen would never permit her to be molested in any way, so she may be said to have enjoyed their protection. She made a cult of her George's memory, dressing always as a widow and wearing the deepest weeds. She was of a pious, not to say superstitious, turn of mind, and declared that George I had told her that his devotion was so great that he would return to her even after her death. So one day, when a raven hopped in at the window, the bereaved Duchess took it into her head that this was the reincarnation of the dead king. She captured the bird, put it into a golden cage, kept it always by her, and provided for it in her will. Her death took place in 1743 at the advanced age of 85 years. Her wealth was divided among her German relations, and Kendal House was converted into a tea garden and afterwards pulled down. End of section 1.